You are listening to Insights from the Conference Board.
Hello, I'm Rebecca Ray, Executive Vice President of Human Capital at the Conference Board, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to another Insights podcast. I'm joined today by Chuck Mitchell, our Executive Director of Content Quality, and the lead author on our topic for today, which is the findings from the brand new report, the C-Suite Outlook 2022, Reset and Reimagine. Now in its 23rd year with 1,600 plus executives, 900 plus of whom were CEOs, we fielded this survey in October and November of last year. So we're excited to share the brand new findings from this report, and I'm delighted to welcome you, Chuck. You know, you've been the lead author on this for most of its 23 years, and it's a pleasure to partner with you each year and a delight to have you today to chat with. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Rebecca. It's great to be here. Absolutely.
Well, I have a couple questions, and certainly there's the entire report to read, but I wanted to focus on a couple of the very biggest findings, and let's talk about inflation, which was a big concern this year, both from a heightened ranking from in the past as well as a projected duration of just how long CEOs thought this inflationary period was gonna last. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the inflation, what a difference a year makes. I mean, in our survey last year, inflation wasn't on anyone's radar. Of our listings, it was down near the bottom. It was in 20. It was in the 25 or 26 out of 30, and this year it's skyrocketed up to the number two position, and it's pretty much universal. It's global across all geographies, economy sizes, industries. It's really reared its head in the last 12 months, and it's really posing a major concern for CEOs and C-suite executives in the year to come. It's a unique challenge, one really that hasn't been faced by organizations in decades. So that's creating a real issue for most organizations. I think one of the interesting findings on this is really about the duration. We hear a lot of talk about inflation being transitory, but in the view of CEOs, this is inflation is not going away anytime soon. I mean, they're really looking for this inflationary impact and environment to be around the majority past 2023 and beyond. So it's as I said, it's not going away anytime soon.
Yeah, and that wasn't just a small number of CEOs. That was more than half of them that thought this was going to be here for a long, long time.
Yeah, even the most optimistic view has it until the end of 2022 and the end of this coming year. So, but it really is a long term duration, and there's so much that feeds into it over the long term. I mean, you have some issues such as demographic change, this notion around labor shortages, which is also a very high issue of concern. For CEOs in the coming year. So the notion that once the supply chain is fixed, that inflation will be tamed is probably not the persistent view. I mean, we're looking at factors such as things from the change in working from home versus cities, the industrial policies, transition to renewable energies. All these, even onshoring of supply chains, are all inflationary factors that are likely to persist even once the pandemic subsides. So it's definitely a longer term issue that all organizations are going to need to address.
So, Chuck, it makes you wonder if inflation is going to be rampant for some time. And we've all seen the headlines, and certainly one of the high concerns they had was, supply chain disruptions. Doesn't that just portend higher prices for consumers and an even more challenging scenario as time goes on?
Yeah, it certainly does. And there's a whole secondary effects that will come through from inflation. Things like wage pressures, again tied to the labor shortages. But yeah, there's a lot of inflationary trends that are looking. Housing demand among millennials, certainly in the U.S., is another one that's driving inflation. But when you look at how CEOs how they're going to mitigate this risk or mitigate the threat of inflation, they are looking to cut to cut costs of their inputs, that's going to be a tough haul negotiating factor because, again, I think you point to the wage inflation driving a lot of this issue. And they're also looking to, as you said, pass these price increases down the line to the consumers. So the end users are going to pay for the tightness of the inputs to manufacture and make. And as a last resort, their third ranked issue to mitigate inflation was this absorbing prices into their profit margins. Not too many companies actually want to act on that, and that would probably be one of the notions of last resort. But it's going to put pressure on margins throughout. And then you have a notion of looking to change suppliers. So that's not necessarily a short-term fix. We know the complexity of supply chains today, uh, and scarcity of some. Take chips. For example, there are very few manufacturers globally that can meet any kind of demand out there. So changing suppliers, bringing material or bringing manufacturing onshore is also highly inflationary. So it's going to be a long and tough battle to tame the inflation beast for sure.
I would think so because it's combined with, supply chain disruptions at the time. It's not as though you're dealing with a single issue, right? So, well, when they talked about top external challenges, certainly COVID-19 related disruptions were at the top of the list from a global perspective. But for US CEOs, it was labor shortages at the top, and COVID was ranked fourth. Now, granted, this survey was fielded last October, November, just before the real hit of the latest Omicron wave. But, these two challenges are intertwined, the COVID-19 and labor shortages, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. We have workforces that are not returning to the workplace. I mean, some of it's fear of infection, but it goes much deeper than that. It's really about one of the things about the pandemic. It's given, especially in the lower paid industry categories like retail, like the service sector, restaurants. It's given people time to reflect a little bit. And even though in the U.S. the stimulus has ceased, people aren't flocking back to the jobs. They're rethinking what they want in life. I guess it's a bigger picture, if you will, and that's this notion around creating labor shortages, and that feeds that starts to feed the inflation, that starts to feed the supply chain disruption. In the US we don't have warehouse workers, we don't have truck drivers to meet that. All of that feeds in, and I think it's kind of interesting that we looked in the US certainly, COVID related disruptions is ranked fourth. In Europe it's 10th. But when you look at China, Japan, Asian economies, the COVID related disruptions are top of their list. Interesting, in China, labor shortages is ninth. It's further down the list. So in the US, I think COVID's had a unique kind of impact, if you will, on the labor market, much more so than it has in China, say, or Japan.
And would you say that some of that might be reflective of the fact that you have so much manufacturing in China, and those are not jobs that can be done remotely for the most part? If you've got COVID rolling around, then of course that's going to have an impact there.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and we've seen China go through what we've termed here at the conference board the long soft fall, where those double-digit growth rates have really slowed down. I mean, we're looking at 3 or 4% growth rate in China in over the next decade. So, the fact that China's manufacturing base is so large is something that end users in the U.S., Europe, and mature economies are not going to be able to avoid. And again, I think that's an issue around changing suppliers.
Hmm.
It's just a very complex and long term strategy. And even those countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, uh, that could potentially fill the gap, still have a long way to go. Their manufacturing base is relatively small. So China's as a manufacturing center is going to be around a long time, and other countries, organizations are going to have to deal with that at least over the medium to short to medium term, definitely.
Well, it's not like any of these can really be dealt with in isolation, right? We asked them, what are your external challenges? And between COVID, inflation, and labor shortages, and supply chain disruption, and regulation, and recession risk, and cybersecurity, I mean, it's a lot. It's a lot to deal with. And they're all in many cases interconnected. So one of the surprising findings was around the relatively low CEO perceptions about their organization's ability to face a future crisis. I mean, given how much they're really addressing now. It was lower than some of the C-suite respondents, and generally speaking, CEOs are an optimistic bunch. What do you make of that?
Yeah, and that was, I think, one of the more interesting findings that we found, that when you look at, we asked about the CEO view of their organization's ability to handle future crises, and we were surprised. I mean, CEOs are generally much more optimistic than the rest of the organization when it comes to looking out and meeting these kind of future crises. And so, even less than 50% globally felt that they would be able to handle the next pandemic, even though we've had, if you call, lack of a better term, practice with this one.
Hmm.
But, as I say, it was 49% of CEOs felt that their organization would be ready to deal with that major crisis, but 60% of C suite leaders did. So the same about financial instability. Less than 50% of CEOs, but more than 50% of the C-suite leaders felt that they could deal with this. The C-suite leaders felt that their organizations were more capable of handling inflation than CEOs did. Same about, because the biggest gap is in cybersecurity, where you have 51% of the C-suite leaders, those that are dealing with a cyber issue on a daily basis and in their operations, felt that they could handle a crisis in cybersecurity, but only 37% of CEOs felt that way. Even around climate change, C-suite leaders were more optimistic about handling a future crisis than CEOs were. So that again, it's this notion around it kind of flips the conventional wisdom on its head, because CEOs are generally much more optimistic about their organization's ability to handle such issues. And this time we saw the C-suite is ready to take it on.
It's encouraging that they feel that way because they're a little closer to some of the execution on these things. I wonder if it's a little bit less around not knowing what to do, given that they've seen some of these things. It's not the first trip to the dance with COVID, but I wonder if it's somehow a reflection of the sort of exhaustion and fatigue that we all have from COVID and a variety of things coming at us. So I don't know. It was just interesting because that level of optimism just wasn't in the findings here. So.
Yeah, I think that point about fatigue, that's very real, and I think it's reflected in a lot of. There's a resignation that yes, COVID, COVID is here, and this is the reality, and you can almost. If the survey could talk, you'd hear this kind of sigh coming from some of the responses overall, that you see that too in this notion around inflation. There's this resignation. It's here, we're going to have to deal with it. It's going to be rising wages, it's going to be rising costs. It's not going to go away. I think this creates, between COVID and the COVID secondary effects about inflation, about or labor shortages, it's created a really unique environment. And I think, to your point, that there is fatigue out there, and we see it, we hear it from our members, almost on a daily basis. The burnout is real.
Well, Chuck, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about remote working and the war for talent and what CEOs and C-suite leaders told us about culture and the hybrid workplace. So stay tuned. Be right back.
We hope you are enjoying this episode of Insights, our podcast channel that highlights need-to-know information for human capital professionals. In this episode, we are providing insights from our newly released C-Suite Outlook report. As you've just heard, This annual report examines how CEOs are looking at the tsunami of changes coming their way and how they plan to respond. In keeping with our mission at the Conference Board, we provide trusted insights for what's ahead for you and your business. Whether you are a CEO or a member of the C-suite, you will find actionable ideas to help your organization better navigate 2022. You can read this report and others like it, listen to podcasts, register for future webcasts, and find interactive charts all on our website at www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to the Insights podcast. Today, we are speaking about the 2022 C-Suite Outlook, and I'm here with Chuck Mitchell, the lead author, and we've been discussing inflation and supply chain disruptions and a variety of challenges and optimism for the future. And I think we'll shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the internal challenges that our CEO and C-suite leaders who responded to the survey from last October and November told us about.
Thanks, Rebecca. Let's flip tables here a little bit. Let me ask you a couple of questions about some of the findings that we saw related to human capital strategies, and especially as around remote work, because we had a special section on this in the survey about remote work. And we found a third of CEOs globally expect the remote heavy workforces once the pandemic subsides, and that's roughly double what it was prior to the pandemic or pre-pandemic. So tell us more a little bit. How permanent is this shift in remote work? It's not a passing fad by any means, right? That's going to be one of the long-term legacies of COVID.
I believe so. You mentioned earlier that people have had a chance to sort of reflect on their personal lives and their professional lives. And I think when COVID first hit, we were all very optimistic that it would be a few weeks, it would pass, and we'd be done. And the longer it went on, the more we realized that life kind of settled into different patterns. And some people really began to think about what they wanted their remaining work lives to look like and how they wanted to integrate that. And part of the report here, the subtitle is, reset and reimagine. And I think that's exactly what a lot of workers have done. We've proved that, and we knew this even before the pandemic, we've proven that remote work can be as productive as in-person work, and so that's not something that was brand new to us, but it was the ability to integrate lives, which is something that I think a lot of people who didn't work remotely prior to the pandemic realized that they preferred this in some ways. It saved them the commute. It gave them an opportunity to provide care to dependents or to elders. It allowed them to perhaps take breaks and take walks or to be more physically healthy. There are a lot of people who began to think about this, and many have said, I'm not in a rush to try to return to a workplace as though that could really be recreated in a post-pandemic situation. So a lot of people are rethinking that. I do think that most workplaces, at least in the US, looks to be about a 40% remote working schedule. And so there's remote work, then there's a remote, hybrid schedule. But I think people are looking for flexibility. And those companies that can figure out how and when and by whom and where work gets done and do it in a flexible way that accommodates a variety of workers, those are the companies that are going to be much more successful as they look to attract and retain talent in a very tight labor market. And we see how high on the minds of CEOs labor shortages truly are. And I think flexibility will help get them there.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. So when you talk about labor shortages, high on their list of external challenges. When we looked at the internal challenges, attraction and retention of talent was the number one internal focus for 2022 across virtually all geographies, all organizations, all size and industry cuts. And uh, so in this unique business environment, so what are the strategies that CEOs are planning to use to address this challenge, this attract and retain talent challenge?
Yeah, it was the only unanimous thing in the
Yeah.
report, right? So I think you do many of the traditional things. You have sign on bonuses, you perhaps have to increase wages, you might reduce some of the requirements. So, for example, not all jobs require a bachelor's degree, and so taking a look at the credentialing might be one way to increase the pool. It also means probably looking at underrepresented populations, perhaps those who were previously incarcerated, those who perhaps have significant skill gaps and look for training opportunities to bring them in. But I think you also need to be very creative about what are you enticing people to come and do for you? How do you connect them to the mission and purpose? How do you help them see that working for your company and fulfilling your mission for, your clients or your customers is the company that they want to choose in a marketplace where they have many options. And so helping them align what the work is that they might be asked to do with their personal values is a key strategy. I think also there's an opportunity to rethink the way in which work gets done. And if you can put the working model together in ways where people can fit into sometimes non-traditional ways, you stand a better chance of finding a way for the working parent who has childcare needs and has to carve out a shift schedule that looks different, or the ways in which people choose to get work done. Maybe it's more like the old piecework where you would work on a factory floor. Thinking about knowledge work that way can help to break down some of the barriers where we think it's a shift, it looks this way, and it needs to have these kinds of parameters. That's just not the world we're working in. And for a lot of people, they're deciding they just don't want to have a traditional work. They are doing the kinds of things earlier in their career that used to be the purview of those who were looking to bridge retirement with full-time work. And that is they're building a portfolio career, and it gives them the flexibility and the ability to carve out a life that works for them. And that has been an interesting phenomenon because it's not just, let's say, boomers who decide, well, let's just retire early. No, no, they're finding that technology will allow them to continue to work from anywhere. And it's not just the younger generation who you might think is more anxious to get back into the workplace because so much of their work and their social lives are intertwined. There are many who are saying, I just don't want to have that look like the next 30 years of my working life.
Yeah. Good points, definitely so. But when we looked at the CEO strategies versus human capital executive strategies, the respondents in our survey, we did see some divergence in priorities, if you will. CEOs had agile teams as their top list, building a more innovative culture, strengthening the pipeline. But the human capital executives included several things in their top 10 list that CEOs did not. And that included recruiting a diverse workforce, addressing the mental health issues of employees, and offering more flexible work arrangements. Is this a question of alignment between the two? Is this going to be a challenge for organizations?
Chuck, I think that's right. There was a little bit of a disconnect between those who are the human capital executives charged with executing the strategy, given what they know they have to do for a worker experience. They looked at recruiting a more diverse workforce, about addressing mental health needs, building a more inclusive culture. Those were not on the CEO list. And I think it's because they are very aware of the labor market and the kinds of workers and their diverse needs, and that might have driven it. It's also, I think, reflective of the fact that we have a mental health challenge in many workplaces across America, and we have, a workforce that for the last couple of years, at least in the United States, and certainly a little bit longer in other parts of the world, they have spent an inordinate amount of time trying to hold together their work commitments and their personal lives, and they are exhausted. And the mental health challenges, I think it's the tip of the iceberg that we are seeing. And in some of the other work we've done here at the conference board, we asked employees, thousands of them told us, one of the biggest things that organizations could do to help them and support them through their mental health challenges was flexibility. And it is that opportunity to dial up and dial down the intensity of work or to think creatively about how work gets done and where. That can go a long way. It's usually not as difficult to lift. It's about being flexible. It's about knowing an employee needs and to have an empathetic, caring manager who can figure that out.
Yeah. Good point. And we asked about hybrid work, the hybrid work model, and it was interesting to get the CEO perspective on the advantages and disadvantages that they see from this model. Can you give us a little more detail on what they told us?
Yeah, so the hybrid model was pretty high on the discussion lists of folks in the responding survey, and they told us that they expected this hybrid work model to have an increase in the competition for talent. Because certainly, if you can work from anywhere, you can now pick up talent from around the world, and you're no longer geographically bound. They also thought that it would be easier to retain talent if they were flexible and had this kind of hybrid work arrangement. They were pretty high on worker productivity and innovation, right? So that's what they expected would come of that, because many CEOs, when you talk to them, will say they see a correlation between the sparks that happen in the office, in the workplace, and innovation and opportunities to sustain their culture. On the flip side, they said that they thought this hybrid work arrangement would have an impact on the strength of the culture, and that's a concern I think that many of them shared. And I'm of several minds here. I do think that culture is, of course, the net result of what leaders do or fail to do that holds an organization together. It's the unwritten rules, it's the belief in the strong future of the organization, and it's the values that are held in common. Right? And I don't think that being in person is the only way to foster those or to maintain them. But I do think it presents an opportunity for CEOs and leaders to articulate why a return to the office can do all those things. There are a variety of really good reasons why you might want to return to the workplace. I think companies have an opportunity to re recruit their existing employees and to help them understand why coming together can be a benefit to them personally in terms of, let's say, development or training or mentorship or opportunities to hear directly from C suite leaders in a more informal setting. But I think it also needs to be selectively used, because simply returning to the office just to be able to check a box is, I think, not the right strategy.
Yeah, one of the expectations of the challenge of a hybrid model is the pace of skill building within their workforces. So that skill development is an important aspect for many CEOs for their organization, but the hybrid's going to slow that pace. That's one of the challenges, certainly one of the challenges that they face, right? And this notion of maybe the office is more a happy hour or permanent happy hour venue than it is a place where work gets done. It's a social venue rather than a work venue.
Perhaps, at the end of the day, to greater or lesser degrees, most humans are social creatures. And so, depending on your level of desire for or comfort with, human interaction, there's a lot to be said for people who get to know people on a personal basis, build trust, and sometimes that makes work go a little bit more smoothly. It also perhaps helps people trust their colleagues and know that sometimes when our emails or a, a, a video call sometimes can be misinterpreted, knowing that you trust your colleagues and that they're coming from a good place can help a lot with that.
Yeah.
That is, certainly not the only way to build trust, but I do think that, the way humans are wired, sometimes that can be a big bonus if you're face to face. But the harsh reality is that's not the reality for many workers. And so I think good leaders, good organizations need to figure out how do you do that, even in a disintermediated world, and how do you make sure that you don't have two classes of workers or two classes of valuable talent, for example, and to make sure that even those who may be remote or largely, in a remote setting, that they have the opportunities for development, for advancement, to be heard, to be seen, and I think organizations need to really think about how do you do that when not all workers are in the same environment and perhaps have a different playing field.
Yeah, I for one would be eager to get back and see some of my colleagues that it's been almost 2 years now. So you know, let's hope the COVID issues are under control and that we can get back to some semblance of for lack of a better term, a new normal.
I certainly hope so. And there are some people who were hired during this time who've never stepped foot into the office. And so I'm sure they're anxious to meet some of their colleagues as well. So let us hope for better days. But I just wanted to say thank you for joining me today, Chuck. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I know that for those of us who have the pleasure of working with you on this project, you have been the guiding star here on this report for many years. And so thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Well, for more information, please visit our website, conference-board.org, or check the link in the podcast description. This has been another Insights podcast from the Conference Board.
This has been Insights from the Conference Board.